So today we're out here at the historic Babcock Mill to test out the 100 megapixel capabilities of the GH6, and yes, I did have to strip out all the audio because of all the wind noise. So this is clearly so much better than what I originally had recorded, even though obviously my mouth is not moving to the words. But don't worry, we're going to jump into the photos right now. So I wanted to try out the 100 megapixel settings on the GH6. Now it takes a series of photos in a burst, and you do have to hold the camera pretty steady even with the IBIS setup in order to maintain it. But it is possible to use this at 400 millimeters, which is 800 millimeter equivalent with the zoom lens I had. So it's a very capable tool. Now, in terms of like what quality you are going to get, it does vary depending on what you're trying to image and how careful you are at holding the camera steady. And it takes a few seconds to process, but overall I found it worked pretty well, and I wanted to show you a few examples. However, when I went to try to take pictures of the water, things got interesting. So the first thing I noticed was that if you try to take a picture and the entire scene has got water moving in it, there seems to be nowhere for the camera to lock on and align and stack, so it failed like 9 times out of 10, and to the point that I was like, the 10th time when I finally got to take a picture, I had to include a certain amount of the shoreline or the rock or something like that in the picture, and I suspect very strongly that the shoreline stability is 100 megapixels worth of resolution, but as you get to the motion elements of the water, I think it's just basically a scaled up 25 based on the first image in your series. That's just my take on looking at the files in really high depth, as you can sort of see here. Another thing I noticed with motion, etc., is that when it did actually try to add stuff in, you ended up with some interesting color shifting. As you can sort of see here in the water, the 100 megapixel is definitely got a magenta tone to it, whereas the 25 seems to be more acceptable. And again, realizing that this is bouncing colors off of all the stuff around it, it isn't necessarily in the image, but it's just that concept of when things are moving, the camera does something to make it work, but it doesn't always make it work the best. So I would recommend always have it combined in there, because at the end of the day, if you have 25 megapixel image, you can always scale it up to 100 in post if you absolutely had to, but this definitely works a lot better for capturing those fine details. So now that I figured out that taking pictures of motion water with the 100 megapixel doesn't really give me anything super more from the water side, I decided to go and again focus on the actual mill itself, and here I went and took a picture of the barn doors. Now, on the left is 25 megapixels, on the right is 100 megapixels, and obviously these are cropped in from the original photo. And what you can definitely see here is two things. Number one, that the 100 megapixel image has more detail in the photo. There's definitely more data in there, but also if you look really carefully, you'll see that especially on the handles, there's less noise in the image. This is the nature of stacking. Your signal to noise ratio is going to improve. And that, I would think, is one of the big advantages of doing this kind of photography, is that you can actually end up reducing the noise, more so than trying to get that extra resolution boost, which I think, again, overkill for 99% of situations. But if you can reduce the noise, in camera, etc., I would take it. And you can definitely see this when we move over to this area here, where we're looking at the barn shadows. So in this first picture here, we're just looking at the 25 megapixel image. You can sort of look at it. Hopefully YouTube will compression it out to a nice visible picture. And then I'm going to switch it over to the 100 megapixel version. And here again, we can see some definite drop in the noise. It's not huge, but it's noticeable, especially in the JPEGs or looking at RAWs once I convert them to TIFFs, because RAWs are still not 100% supported, which hopefully will be soon. Now, one thing I will say about this, if we go and look here in the really dark parts, is that we end up getting sort of this weird smoothing effect. which initially I thought was because it was dark, but then I realized that I'm actually in this particular photo looking at the corner of the frame. And this is the kind of thing where I sit there and say, okay, if I'm not holding it perfectly steady and there's going to be some, error, it's going to be off into the corners of the image or the sides. And I suddenly realized that while this works really well and we get some really good center sharpness, etc., that the edges may not get that 100 megapixel advantage to the same extent as the center of the image. So this is something important to note if you are doing it handheld. I think if you're doing it on a tripod, as long as that tripod is steady, this is not going to be as big an issue. But in handheld, you can end up with a bit of mudding around the corners. Now, not enough to say, oh no, it's worse than the 25 megapixel image, but definitely not that 100 megapixel super great aspect. Although this again is going to depend on what lens you're using, if you have dual IBIS, etc., and how steady you hold the camera. I wanted to show you this photo of a telephone pole with a transformer on it and some trees. And in this photo here, the reason I want to talk to you about it is because the electrical poles and everything there isn't moving, but the trees are. There's always a little bit of wind. And when I looked at the trees and when I looked at the electrical pole, it was very obvious when I started doing some different types of pixel peeping that the pole is really sharp, that they're getting that extra crisp detail on it, and everything there looked really nice, and you could definitely zoom in a bit more and it still looks like a good photo. But on the trees, again, the trees are sort of that 25 megapixel equivalent. I didn't really see a real notable improvement in them, similar to how I had the water. So again, 100 megapixels is a really cool thing to have, but it's got its limits on what it's able to do, being able to focus an image on moving targets, being able to focus an image on scenes where there's a lot of motion or there's not a lot of contrast, and also just simply realizing that in the corners, depending on what lens you have and how hold steady you are, you might end up not getting that full 100 megapixel value out of it, although it's still going to produce a good result. So I'm going to end off this video, this creamy, smooth, 240 frames per second video of the Waterfall, which I think is the main reason people buy the GH6, is for the insane video features, which I humbly ask you to subscribe and check out this playlist of videos about the GH6 as I journey deeper into this camera.